Okay, take it away, Tom.
Welcome to Tom Talks. We're going to look at some late blooming plants today, and I think this is particularly appropriate because I'm kind of a late bloomer myself. I didn't really find the groove of working in the outdoors until I was around 30, and didn't really get started in the field as an actual employee until my late 30s. So I was definitely one of those late bloomers. So I always recount that to young people I meet, because they all feel like they should have met their life partner by the time they're 19 and already know what they want to do with the rest of their life. It takes some of us quite a bit longer to find that groove. So it's okay. And we're going to look at plants today that are blooming, that take their time and come into bloom late in the summer. So this is a graph that we generated with a phenology program, and it looks at the blue line is the running average of the number of plants that have come into bloom over the last 10 days. And then the orange line is the average temperature over the last 10 days. And so with our Tom Talk on spring flowering plants, we were looking at this blooming peak in April and in early May. The second Tom Talk on the midsummer, kind of late spring, midsummer plants was looking at this blooming peak in June and very early July. And now we're going to look at this, not really a blooming peak, but this extension of flowering well into the fall. So it's going to be we're going to look at a lot of plants that occur in prairies. But many of our late blooming plants grow in areas where you have full sunlight, because even though the trees are fully leafed out at this time of year, these plants are still getting lots of sunshine, the ones that are out in the open. So this will be our focus today. And I want to add a little bit of extra here today. I want you to try to find this David Damon. I don't know where it comes from. It comes to me from the movie series, The Golden Compass, which I thought was fun. I'm addicted to it, waiting for the next episodes to come out. Sort of spiritual connection. The compass, it's an animal, but we're going to make it a plant today. And I want you to see if you can find a plant in the presentation today that you have a sort of spiritual connection with. It could be the humble dandelion. I mean, none of us want to think that. We all want to think are a bit more special, but just imagine maybe the dandelion's a rare plant. You never see it except in really high quality natural areas somewhere. Then you would look at this and you would think, "Ooh, wow, that's really nice." The fact that it decorates your yard when you don't want it to. Regardless, it's an interesting plant. Or you could go to the other end of the scale and get something elegant like one of our blazing stars. So see if we can find something today you can kind of call your name. If you are inspired somewhere along the way, just put it in the chat. All right, it's time to get started looking at plants today. I always start off these with just looking at plant structures again. I know most of you know this already, but it's always worth a review. Flowers evolved somewhere around 100 million years ago. Before that, there were plants, and plants created seeds and reproduced, but there were no flowers. A flower is a particular structure, and it has four parts: sepal, petal, stamens, and variously called pistil or carpel in the center. It can have many of these parts, or it can have few, but they're always in the same arrangement when you look at a flower: sepal, petal, stamen, pistil. And just remembering that helps you to understand flowers and helps you to look at them and see the similarities and differences among them. For instance, the carpel in the center, all of these flower parts are modified leaves, meaning that in the evolution of the flower, it was really a group of leaves that were specialized and brought together into the structure we call a flower. This is a drawing of a primitive carpel in which the leaf is folded over, and you can see that the seeds are forming on the inside of that. The first person I know of who came up with this idea of the flower parts as specialized leaves was actually Goethe, the poet philosopher, uh, Germany at the end of the 18th and early 19th centuries. And he had this idea that as the sap in plants would rise, it would purify. And so the basal leaves were the largest and the most crude. The stem leaves were often more elegantly shaped. And then you would get to the flower itself, and the sepals and petals were progressively more specialized. The petals often being attracted colors. And then you get to the actual sexual parts of stamens and pistil in the center. So that guided purification and perfection, and increasing perfection as you went upward. Just a little bit of history of botany. This all comes from Goethe's Metamorphosis of Plants, a fascinating book to read. And when we look at plants, we can look at a number of different things, like the arrangement of those parts. I'll just put these on there also. So we have sepal, petal, stamen, and pistil. There's a sepal, petal, stamen, pistil. And you see they're all attached at the base of the ovary. That's just, we might call that the sort of primitive, the normal arrangement in a flower. They're all attached to what's called the receptacle at the end of the stem. But look over here, most of the flowers we look at today will have this situation where it looks like the sepal, petals, and stamens are attached at the top of the ovary rather than the bottom. And that's an appearance rather than a fact, because sepal, petal, and stamen actually form a layer, and that layer is on the outside of the ovary. So in effect, they actually attach at the bottom, but they only become free and independent parts at the top of the ovary. So we say that they attach at the top, and that covering on the outside of the ovary is called the hypanthium. So we have both superior ovaries and inferior. Superior means above, inferior means below. It doesn't mean quality or anything like that. And we can also look at symmetry of flowers. We'll see both radially symmetric, or what's called actinomorphic, symmetrical around the point, and zygomorphic or bilaterally symmetric across a plane of symmetry. Also, we'll see a lot of fusion in flowers today, fusion of parts. Here, all the sepals are fused together into a cup. At their ends, they separate into little tabs, and so you can count the number of sepals. Over here, it looks like the sepals are separate. They actually look like they might be fused at the base. Here, the petals are fused together into two. Here, they're separate. I won't use the terms polypetalous and gamopetalous. If you really want to impress your friends, you could learn those. Likewise with zygomorphic and actinomorphic, always good to amaze family and friends with a few multisyllabic terms. We're going to look really at the composite family today. It really dominates the flowering of the late season. There are some other plants, and you might wonder, what about those time? Why weren't we going to do those? I had to strike a compromise here. If I try to do everything, it ends up like firing a machine gun of information, and I think it just goes over everyone's head. And so what I'm going to do is going to focus on the composite family, and I'm going to, when you get the PDF later on, there'll be a lot of other plants on the PDF that you can refer to that are also flowering at this time of year. And the other thing that I really haven't covered in any of these plant tom talks are the sedges and grasses and rushes and bulrushes and cattails and spike rushes and burr reeds and all of those plants. And I'm going to say that for winter tom talk. That's a really interesting group of plants, but I think it's better to do them as a unit to look at their similarities and differences. And we often, I mean, I'm out with people all the time in the field, and they are surprised to learn they're not all grass. And they're not, and there are distinct differences between grasses and sedges. So we'll deal with that. We're just not going to deal with it today. Now, looking at the flowers in a composite, they really have two different kinds in a composite flower head. And we'll look at the structure of a head here in a minute. These are the individual flowers. So in a dandelion, all the flowers look like this. They have a long limb, or sometimes called ligule, or you could call it the corolla. There are in fact 5 petals in the basic composite flower, but they're all fused together into a single limb in a dandelion. Outside of the petals should be sepals, right? And if you look at a dandelion when it's in flower, you'll see there are hairs on the outside of where the petal attaches to the ovary. And knowing what we know about flowers, what's outside of the petals has to be sepals. And so the sepals have been modified into hairs that are then push out and they're on a beak that helps the dandelion seeds float into other parts of your yard and pester you even further. Sometimes they're modified into barbs. We'll see the genus bidens where they become barbs that attach to animals or to your clothes as you walk by. Sometimes they're just small little scales, but they're the modified sepals. The petals are here. And so when we go inside of that, we get to the stamens. And here the stamens, the anthers, the pollen-bearing part of the stamen, are all fused together. You have 5 stamens where the anthers fuse together into a tube. And you can see this. If you get a good hand lens and put it under a microscope, you can see this in any composite flower. It's a very conservative family. A lot of these structures are repeated in every member. And you can see that anther tube. And then you can see the female style, the long skinny part, and then the stigma, which is the pollen receptive part, pushes up through that tube and then branches out above. Wonderfully conserved structure in composites and something you can use to recognize composite plants because of this conserved flower structure. So that's what we'll call the ray flower. And we'll look at how all this comes together here in just a second. What we call the disc flower has a symmetrical corolla tube. Again, all the separate petals are fused together into a tube. Similar fusion of anthers in the center and then the style and stigma above. So it's really the symmetry, the different between the disc flowers and the ray flowers. And again, all of these, since they're all attached to the top of the ovary, they're all epigynous or inferior ovary flowers. This is the composite head, and this would be true. This is a nice picture maybe of something like an oxeye daisy or a daisy fleabane. Here are disc flowers with a little symmetrical 5-lobed corolla tube in the center, and hairs modified, the sepals modified into hairs, and there's the staminal tube of the anthers fused together and the style and stigma poking out the middle, and here are the ray flowers on the periphery of the head. And so the composite flower head often find these weird trends. I mean, these are some of those interesting things in studying plants, is looking at the things that at first aren't obvious and that make you wonder why. Why would a plant evolve a complex flower head like this and yet then mimic a simple flower? It looks, most people look at a composite flower head and they call these the petals, but they're not petals. They're the whole corolla tube of a separate flower. And likewise, these are sort of glommed together into the center as male and female parts, but in fact they're all separate little flowers, and they've come together into a head, and then the head evolves to mimic a simple flower. One of those fascinating things you run into in studying the plant world. So let's look at some actual composite species. These are the docks and the genus Silphium. Big, beautiful plants, mostly of our prairies and open areas along rivers and streams and wetlands and prairies. These are pretty easy to tell apart from one another. Prairie docks are the ones that have these, we'll look at the leaves in a second here, but let's first just look at the overall form of the plant here. The prairie dock has these big basal leaves we'll look at more closely here in a second. Similar with a compass plant, although the leaves come up the stem a little bit more on this. They have very large basal leaves, but in this case, very finely dissected. Deems rosin weed has normalish looking leaves coming, they're paired and opposite coming up the stem, all the way up the stem. And cup plant has distinctively cup-shaped leaves. We'll look more closely at that in a second. Now let's look at the dock flower. The docks is interesting. Silphiums, composites evolve this flower head, and yet you see all possible variations. You see flower heads that have only ray flowers, like a dandelion. You'll see flower heads that have only disc flowers, that we'll see in the genus Eupatorium. You see flowers that have both disc and ray flowers, where the ray flowers are sterile and disc flowers are fertile. And you see them where in this case, many of the ray flowers are sterile. Only the outer row of ray flowers and the disc flowers are fertile in a silphium flower, and the center of the disc is sterile. Interesting pattern. Why did this come about? Hard to know the answer to those questions, but just fascinating variety. Start off with a fairly simple plant and then look at all possible variations of that plant as we look through the composite family. We look at the leaves. The prairie dock leaf is, many of these are sort of unmistakable plants. One of the things I can't do in a webinar is to have you put your hands on the leaves of any of these plants. I love tactile sensations in nature, and these are thick, rough leaves, all of them. The thickness and roughness of them, I believe I could identify, at least put it in a genus with my eyes closed if someone just allowed me to put my 2 fingers around one of these leaves. So you can see great difference in the shape of the leaves here. They're very finely dissected. Compass plant leaf laciniatum refers to a laciniate or deeply cut leaf. The prairie dock is just the opposite, having these big, almost heart-shaped leaves. Occasionally you see hybrids between the two that are sort of halfway between. The rosin weed has the same thick, rough texture, but much smaller leaves that come up the stem in opposite pairs. And the cup plant has these wonderful cups here. Even dew in the morning will fill those cups. So if you walk through cup plants late in the morning, in a summer morning when there's been a heavy dewfall, you walk out the other side and you're absolutely drenched. You've just taken a shower. They're just full of water. Fascinating group of plants, really common along our rivers and streams and prairies and wetlands. Next, let's look at the sunflowers. We're going to see a lot of yellow flowers today. It seems to be you wonder whether the very first composites 50 or so million years ago evolved with yellow flowers, because it seems to be so common as we look across the many different composite species. Here are sunflowers. It's universal among the sunflowers. Let's look at three common ones. The annual sunflower, which is actually not all that common in nature. You see it planted around people's homes because it has a big flower with a big brown head in the center and big heart-shaped leaves. The sawtooth sunflower is probably it is the most common of the prairie and into sort of wet meadow, even into edges of wetlands and sedge meadows. Sunflower, also aggressive, we often don't put it, or at least put very little seed in our restorations because it can become just super dominant. And this Helianthus stremosus is one of the woodland sunflowers, the most common one in my experience. So I put it here. If you look into a plant key, it will show you things like Divaricatus and Decapetalus, all of which are really, really hard to tell apart. But at least the woodland sunflowers, we sort of deal with those as a group. Now in this, I've sort of put some notes up here that will help as you look through this later on in the PDF. I mean, the big heart-shaped leaves of the annual sunflower make it sort of unmistakable in that really big flower. The glaucus is waxy, the sort of white wax you see on the surface of plant parts, often leaves and stems, the fancy name epi or above epicuticular, and the cuticle is the hard waxy covering of the leaf. Epicuticular wax, it's almost a poem in and of itself. So a waxy, not just smooth, but waxy stem. The leaves start off as opposite below and become alternate as you get up above. And then the sunflower has a sort of bristly, the woodland sunflower has a bristly, hairy stem, and the leaves are opposite all the way up. So those three are fairly easy to tell apart. But one of the things you want to look for when you look at a sunflower and try to tell it apart from some of the other yellow composites is that the ray flowers are sterile. There is no stigma and style coming out of the ray flower, much less any staminal tube. So there are no sexual parts to the rays. They've been specialized simply to attract pollinators. And the sexual business end is all in the disc flowers. They're both male and female. So here, rather than of the dock, where the only fertile flowers are along the outside. Here, the only fertile flowers are really in the disc, and that's where you look for the sunflower seeds. When I'm telling us apart, we did the false sunflower with our last Tom talk on midsummer plants, the Heliopsis. That one is has fertile rays. And so if you're ever in doubt, just look closely at the rays with your magnifying glass and you can see that little stigma, stylon stigma poking out, and you know it's not one of the true sunflowers. And there are the leaves. Pretty easy three to tell apart. Remember those sterile ray flowers, and telling apart these, vegetatively telling the three apart is pretty straightforward. What I want to look at now is under the more subtle things about flowers, and it's fascinated me ever since I learned about it. And I do this. I put this into presentations each time, or something like this, because I don't want this to become just a name game where we're just sort of going through one plant after another and memorizing names and turning nature's beauty into a Latin binomial. I want to look at some of the things that don't immediately strike your eye. In fact, you could study plants for years and never notice this. And I want you to notice it now. When you look at a composite head that's coming into flower, you'll see that it's the flowers around the edge of the head that start to flower first. And then if you watch that flower, progressively, the flowering moves inward toward the center of the head. And I'm going to call that subtilizing our thinking. I get that it's not really a real word, but I call it a real word because it was used by Herman Melville in his book on Moby Dick. He was trying to get us away from just expanding our mind with more and more and more and more facts and looking at the more subtle things in nature. So I would say this is sort of subtilizing our thinking when we look at plants and looking at things that we initially don't notice. And we call this pattern of a composite flower head, that it's flowers on the outside, and then progressively that flowering moves inward. We call that an indeterminate flowering pattern. And so we can look at an indeterminate flowering pattern on a plant with a raceme as it's growing upward. The shoot is growing upward, and as it grows, it creates flower buds, and these are the older buds, and as it grows up, it creates more and more flower buds. And the first ones to flower, the first ones that were created. The older flower buds flower first, and so the flowering seems to chase the shoot as it grows upward. And we can see how you can turn that into a head like a composite head. And this is how a composite head was initially formed in an evolutionary sense. You start off with this open array of flowers in a raceme. You eliminate these pedicels and you draw the flowers in and create a spike. And then the portions of the central axis between the flowers shrink and eventually bring the flowers together. The receptacle at the base expands and you create a flower head from an open raceme. And in this case, you create a flower head where it flowers first on the outside, and then that flowering progresses inward toward the center. We can see that when we look indeterminate flower. I'm just going to leave the composite family for a moment. These are legumes. This is purple prairie clover. And you'll notice how the flowers are starting at the base and moving upward on this purple prairie clover head. They're starting at the base of a lead plant inflorescence and moving upward toward the growing tip of the flower cluster. So that's an indeterminate flowering pattern. And we see that in the composite head. But we can find determinate flowering arrangements in the plant world also, where the shoot grows out, it stops, and the oldest flower bud forms at the tip, and then you have side branches form and lower, and these flower buds form second, and then flower second, and you can have that happen again. You create what's called a cyme. This is the array of flowers, then the determinate flowering head, and so the first to flower, second to flower, third to flower. Different from the indeterminate flowering arrangement. And this is my favorite, the scorpioid cyme. It's a wonderful name in which the shoot grows out, creates a flower bud, then a side branch comes off, creates another flower bud, another side branch comes off, creates another. And you're thinking, well, this is some plant that grows in the Himalayas? No. We can find scorpioid cymes growing very nearby. This scorpioid cyme typically, as the flowers start to open, unravels and starts to look like an indeterminate flowering raceme, doesn't it? Because it flowers at the base and proceeds to the end. But no, this is the tip of the shoot, side branch, another tip of the shoot, side branch, another tip of the shoot. And so you have what looks like an indeterminate arrangement that actually evolves from a determinate flowering arrangement. And we have that in a very common weed in our area called stickseed, which is in it's a Boraginaceae. I'm losing the common name of that family, but it's not a huge family, but it has several members. And what looks like an indeterminate flowering arrangement, see it's still flowering out here. Actually, this was the tip of the stem, and then a side branch came to form this. Another side branch came to form this, another side branch, another side branch. So even though the flowering proceeds from base to tip, it's actually doing the opposite in a way. I just find these things just fascinating about the flowering world. It's so easy to look at this and not think about it. And then when you see it, now I can't look at a stick seed and not think about this every time I see the plant. And the fascinating thing about the composites is that each flowering head, right? It's what, indeterminate or determinate? Remember, it starts flowering on the outside and moves in. So that's an indeterminate flowering head. And yet when you look at the whole composite plant, like this blazing star, look, the heads on the end are opening first, and the wave of flowering moves downward along that spike of heads. And that's consistent amongst at least all of the composites I've looked at, follow that same pattern. If the individual heads are indeterminate, and yet the overall flowering of the larger plant has a determinate pattern going from the tip of the plant downward toward the base. Just a wonderful little peculiar puzzling. Why would any plant do that? I don't have the answer to that question. I just love that you can ask the question. So there's our determinate flowering arrangement with the first flower here, side branches, second, third, and then these coming forth. When you turn it into a head, the pattern often gets a bit mixed up. And likewise, when you turn that into an umbel, the flowering doesn't just move smoothly either from center to outside or outside to inside. But we can see determinate flowering arrangements in nature. The bee balm starts flowering in the center. You can see these buds along the outside haven't opened yet. And the meadowsweet, I thought I took a better picture than that. I actually took that picture myself along the prairie trail just a few days ago. Because it's hard to find determinate arrangements here. It's obviously flowering at the tip, and the wave of flowering is moving downward along the plant. So you'll never be able to look at a plant without thinking about that now. All right, now let's look at a really puzzling group called goldenrods. Goldenrods get a lot of bad press because they come out at the same time as ragweed is releasing its pollen, and so everyone thinks it's the goldenrod, which you can see the fields turning yellow and your sinuses filling up, and you cause an effect. You say the goldenrods must be causing your allergy, but that's rarely true. I mean, the goldenrods are insect pollinated, so they produce relatively small amounts of pollen. It's sticky in order to stick to the insect's legs who visit the plant, so it doesn't blow around in the air all that much. I mean, if you start snorting the pollen, I don't do a lot of smelling of flowers because I have hay fever. I don't do a lot of smelling of flowers in the fall because I know almost any pollen will cause a reaction. But it's not goldenrod that's causing your allergy. It's ragweed, and we'll get to ragweed later. It's also a composite. So we're going to look at 3 different characteristics of goldenrods to try to help you tell apart some of the common ones. Pubescence on the stem. Sometimes it's very fine. If I can feel it usually. I always have a hand lens around my neck. It's something I kind of put on in the morning when I get up, which makes me weird. It's just, I have to use it to read small print these days. So look for that sometimes very fine hairs. Secund, and that's a word that you're not used to. Look at how the flowering branch here comes out, and all the flowers are on one side of that branch, and they're all pointed more or less upward. That's called a secund arrangement, as opposed to the flowers sticking off symmetrically in all directions from the flowering axis. In the secund arrangement, they're all on one side. And the reduction of the leaves upward. This is actually not hard to see when you're in the field. It is very hard. The pictures never do it justice. But it is true when you look at a plant where the leaves, these plants where the leaves reduce consistently as you go upward, typically are holding their base of leaves. And then as you go up, there's a pretty strong reduction in leaf size, as opposed to things like tall goldenrod, where yes, the most upward leaves are smaller, but it's typically lost its basal leaves by the time it's flowering. For a considerable distance along the stem, the leaves are about the same length. And so we're going to use those three characters to look at a lot of plants. So I don't want you to get freak out here looking at plants that all look alike. We're going to try to look at some characteristics where we can tell these, and all of them are goldenrods you can run into just walking through the fields and prairies in the Chicago area. And we're going to start with the one on the far right, the elm-leaved goldenrod, because that's one that's almost separated off by habitat. Once you get into the woods, you'll occasionally see a stray tall goldenrod, but for the most part, the goldenrods you see there will often in an oak savanna anyway, particularly one that's under restoration, you'll see the elm-leaf goldenrod that has given its name elm leaf, has a wide leaf, a wide serrate leaf. Look at the secund flowering arrangements, but its habitat in that wide leaf really separated off from basically all the other goldenrods you're going to run into in the Chicago area. Let's look at the other ones now. Look at, they're all secund flowering arrangements except for the showy goldenrod. You see how that's a sort of symmetrical plume of flowers coming up, and it is very showy and pretty, but it doesn't have these secund branches. So now we have these four left. Let's see, we've got a pubescent stem, very obvious pubescent stem on the tall goldenrod, and it's sort of lookalike species, the late goldenrod, both of which leaves only very gradually reproduce or reduce as you grow upward. This one has a glabrous glaucous, smooth, waxy stem. This is a rough stem, so they're not hard to tell apart. The tall goldenrod or the late goldenrod is in wetter areas, wet meadows, wet prairies. The old field goldenrod, which is a step less common than either the tall or the late goldenrod. This one has leaves that strongly reduce as you move upward. Again, the secund branching and a pubescent stem. Here the leaves are strongly reducing with the early goldenrod, which does flower a bit earlier. I put it in with this group anyway. So it's flowering a bit earlier. It's secund branching, but a smooth stem, and the leaves are reduced in size pretty progressively as you move upward. So if you remember relatively few characters, you can identify most of the common goldenrods you see. So don't panic when you see goldenrods and think you can't tell them apart. It's really not that hard to tell most of the species apart. And here is another set of goldenrods that we used to put them all in the genus Solidago. Now they've been put in the separate genera. The hairy grass-leaf goldenrod is very common in old fields and does grow in prairies and even into sedge meadows, but hence the name grass-leaf would imply that it has very narrow leaves, and it does. But a more or less flat-topped group of flowers, and the stems are quite, again, roughly pubescent, roughly like a tall goldenrod. The stem has that same sort of rough, very short, stiff, hairy feel to it. The stiff goldenrod does have a pubescent stem, but the really neat thing about this is the wider leaves that to me feel like a sort of stiff piece of suede. Hairy, but very short hairs and stiff hairs, and so densely on there, it feels like stiff suede leather. And stems, and this is a much rarer goldenrod. It fins the Ohio goldenrod. The stem and leaves are glabrous. So again, at a distance maybe looking similar. When you start looking at really relatively few characters, it's not that hard to tell them apart. I mean,
Tom, I had a question on the goldenrods.
Okay.
Are goldenrods good for pollinators?
Well, certainly, I don't know about the diversity of pollinators. I do know that they, I mean, they're obviously insect pollinated plants. I don't have any in my swale yet, so I haven't really observed them up close. It's a really good question, one that I need to find an answer to. If anyone else online right now has an inside line, and they put it in the chat, and Jackie could read it out later, but I'm not sure I can come up with a good answer to that, other than they are insect pollinated plants. And sometimes the size and the spectacular nature of the flower really don't have much to do with the diversity of pollinators that use a flower. Regardless of what it might seem, sometimes I absolutely do not have an encyclopedic mind, or what I call real botanists, people that actually write the books, do have encyclopedic minds, and I'm constantly in awe of them. What I do as an ecologist is if I'm going to work in an area, I really focus on an area, look at the range of choices I have ahead of me. I do some study ahead of time. I collect a few plants, and I take them through the keys, and I get all of the plants that I'm likely to encounter, and I get those in my head, and then I work with an area. I can't hold the flora of a region in my head, so these presentations come from a lot of effort of pulling it all together. It's not that I just know all of this stuff off the top of my head. I'm just trying to make you feel a little bit.
I had a couple of comments about goldenrod. So Brenna shared, I've found them to be great for pollinators. Wasps, bees, and butterflies love them. They're one of the latest flowering plants in the fall, which is a great late source of nectar. And a couple of fun facts about goldenrod. Thomas Edison used goldenrod that he cultivated to produce rubber. Henry Ford gave Thomas Edison a Ford Model T with tires produced from goldenrod. The plant was used as a dowsing rod to find water. Goldenrod was thrown into the Boston Harbor at the time of the Boston Tea Party, and colonists drank it as tea for their health. There's over 130 different goldenrod species in the genus. It's the state flower of Kentucky, Alabama, and Nebraska. And the scientific name solidago means to make whole or to heal.
That reminds me, when I go camping, I always, usually tall goldenrod grows everywhere, and grass leaf goldenrod is sort of one of the next most common ones. Those two have a lot of the oils in them that flavor the tea, and I love goldenrod tea. You wouldn't think it, but you pick some green leaves and boil them in water, and you get this wonderful yellow tea, which has a really nice aroma. You can get that same aroma by just crushing the leaf and smelling. In fact, it's the only genus that I know of that has that smell. It becomes more potent by this time in the year, in the springtime, that those oils evidently haven't concentrated in the leaf as much. So there's a lot of fascinating things about goldenrod. The smell is something I noticed because I like touching and scratching and smelling things. I noticed that many, many years ago when I was first learning about flowers. Now, this is an interesting genus of most of the things we've been looking at have been perennials so far. The annual sunflower is an exception. Most of them have been perennials. These are all annuals. These are called beggar ticks or bidens, the genus bidens. And they all grow in wet places, typically around in wetlands, sometimes mud flats. They're annuals, so they don't tend to grow in areas of really intense competition with perennial plants. So you see them in mud flats along the edges of streams, wetlands, shorelines, most commonly. And now I remembered what I forgot. I wanted to give you pictures of the seeds, and I forgot to do that. But the seed has little barbed prongs on it, sometimes called Spanish combs, that will then stick in your socks as you walk through a field of this when they're in flower. So the sepals in this case have been modified into little spikes, little barbed spikes that will stick in your socks or stick to any animal that walks by when the plant is in seed. So in looking at these, again, fairly similar plants growing in similar places, we'll notice that the ray flowers are absent in many of them. There are a few more than this. These genera are much bigger than ones I can deal with today, but I'm just looking at some of the more common ones you would encounter in McKinney and nearby counties. When the rays are present, it's probably Cernua. There's some others, Aristosa, but this is probably the more common one. This has simple leaves. Here we have simple leaves with lacking in rays. With a 5-lobe disc flower. Here's simple rays, simple leaves, lacking rays, with a 4-lobe flower, which is very unusual for composites. That's a really derived feature. I don't know of any other composite, and maybe other composites that have lost one of their flower. That symmetry of 5s is just almost universal amongst composites. That's really unusual. And then the compound leaves of the Bidens frondosa, all growing along shorelines and wetlands. So one of the ways, I'm not encouraging you to pull plants up, but if you're in the college of studying plants, with an annual plant, typically it doesn't take much of a tug and it comes right out of the ground because the root system is really relatively small. We're doing that with Japanese brome the other day, trying to identify, making sure that wasn't one of the native bromes that comes out of the ground really easily because it's got a very tiny little root system. Perennials typically are much more deeply rooted. Now the asters. These are real hair pullers for a lot of people, particularly the white asters that are flowering all kind of together late in the year, and at a distance of 30 feet, they can initially look very, very similar. Well, if you're looking at a white aster, first of all, if you're in any sort of open field, disturbed area, about 90% of the asters are going to be hairy aster, very common species with long, relatively long, what's called pilose pubescence along the stem. Very common, and it does go into higher quality natural areas, but it becomes dominant to the exclusion of other asters, and you get into weedy areas. Ericoides, heath aster is much less common, at least in the Chicago area. I only rarely see it as a wild occurring plant. Much smaller leaves and much smaller flower heads. This one, just to the gestalt on this, once you've seen it once, you'll never confuse it with anything else because of the much smaller size of the flower heads and leaves. The panicled aster, visually from a little bit of a distance, you can confuse that with a hairy aster, but this one is completely smooth. It does tend to grow in slightly higher quality situations and with less disturbance into wet meadows and mesic prairies. And the side flowering aster, for some reason, this is my favorite. Maybe this would be my my daemon. There's something very well, the leaves come out sort of almost at right angles to the stem. So I've always been kind of a square guy. And this, there's something sort of square about this plant. You see the main stem vertical, and then these side branches that come out at almost at right angles to that main stem, and then each of the flower heads is on a short little peduncle, and you get these distinctive arrays of flowers sticking out from the center. That's to me, to my eye, there's some things that you learn by small characters, and some things that just the gestalt just says it when you look at it. And the overall form of the side flowering aster is really distinctive. Just get used to looking at it. Initially, you may have to get closer and look at some smaller features and run it through keys, but once you get the gestalt down, it's a very easy one. It just jumps out to you. Likewise with the heath aster.
Hey, Tom, we had another question.
Okay.
Just to refresh, what does glabrous mean?
Glabrous means smooth. It means it's not hairy. Sorry. So any smooth area would be glabrous. If it's waxy, would either say waxy, or if the waxy is visible as sort of a white cloudy appearance, we call it glaucous. But in both cases, if something is glabrous or glabrous and glaucous, it's hairless. And so the hairs can be very, very tiny, and it simply feels rough, or they can be very long and tangled and woolly. But we'll just use the word pubescent to sort of cover that range. So glabrous refers to hairless. Okay. The blue asters, for the most part, are a little easier to tell apart from one another. If you're down in the wetlands, you're probably going to be looking at one of these two. The New England aster is the deepest sort of violet blue color and really puts on a show. I mean, these grow like little spirea bushes. They can get very large. I still remember my grandmother in Virginia had one of these in her backyard at the end of the one of the clothesline posts, had a big New England aster growing under it, and it was like 3 feet across and 4 feet, 5 feet high. This huge bushy plant, just covered in these, because I visited at the end of summer, just covered in these blue violet flowers or flower heads. Just a gorgeous plant, somewhat more subtle in its coloring. Of more faint color is the bristly aster we see very commonly in wetlands, particularly in McHenry County. I see this just as being the dominant aster of many of our wetlands and wet meadows. The leaves of New England aster are very much cordate. It means that they have earlobes that reach around the stem. The stem is very hairy. The stem of the bristly asters is smooth, and the leaves are clasping, meaning that they really don't have a petiole, but they're not nearly as earlobed as are the leaves of the New England aster. So those two, once you've identified those once, you'll never confuse those two. The Drummond's aster is really an aster of woodlands. Many of our oak woods today have Drummond's aster in them. It is somewhat slightly weedy aster. It will occur in pretty degraded woods and along the edges of woods. It does need a little more sunlight than if the woods is full of buckthorn. And it has a sort of faint blue color. The stem and the leaves are both sort of rough and pubescent. The Shorts aster is really more and higher quality oak savannas. The whole plant has a more delicate look to it. The stems are narrower, the petioles of the leaves are narrower. The leaves themselves are narrower. They are heart shaped. The stem is smooth and glabrous. So it's a very delicate, beautiful flower of our oak savannas. Typically, oak savannas are still in pretty good shape and haven't been full of invasive shrubbery for a long time, because this would have been crowded out if that were the case. So those are four. Again, if you look in the flora of the Chicago region and look under asters and the genus Symphotrichum, you'll find that it's a huge key with lots and lots of species. I've only picked out ones that you're probably most commonly going to come in contact with as you walk around the natural areas of the northwest part of the Chicago area. Well, there is another aster called the arrow-leafed aster, and it used to be called a subspecies of, or Drummond's aster was a subspecies of arrow-leafed aster. Now they're called two different species, both in the genus Symphotrichum, Europhyllum for the arrow-leafed, and Drummondii for the Drummond's aster. The arrow-leafed aster typically has an almost white ray flowers, and much less pubescence, tending toward more glabrous stem and leaf than does the Drummond's aster. And in my experience, and this is not in the Keys, my experience, it tends to be more out in the prairies and woodland edges and not in the woods as much as Drummond's aster, but that's just my experience with those two. So let's stop for about 5 minutes, just take a quick break, and we'll reconvene in about 5. You can, if you haven't given your plant daemon any thought yet, give it some thought. I almost switched my daemon as I went through this time. You can't do that once you pick one, I think, at least according to Golden Compass. But so pick carefully. And we'll see you again in 5 minutes. If you have any questions, you can certainly hang around and ask them at this time. So, oh, there it is. So I can.
Got a question popped up in the chat. Do all of the asters shown require full sunlight for blossoming? Same question for goldenrod.
Well, no, when you get into the woods, certainly both genera are much more common in open areas, and typically in any large genus, the common features like yellow color or even ecological features are the primitive features, meaning the very first goldenrods and asters probably were growing out in the open. And they pass those traits down to most of their ancestors. But if we go into the woods with asters, you can see side flowering aster, you see shorts aster. Side flowering aster will occur in wetlands and in open areas, but it also occurs in oak savannas. I'm talking about oak savannas that still have a lot of sunlight coming in. By the time you get into sugar maple woods, about the only goldenrod that's left is one I didn't do today, which is zigzag goldenrod. At least in our area, that's about the only goldenrod left. Asters, yeah, typically they're in woods that are fairly open and sunny. So partial shade, yes, you'll still get some. Typically, the species change, but you'll still get some goldenrods and asters in our woods here. But when you get into really shady woods or sugar maple woods, those genera become scarce or absent.
Feel free to either unmute or throw any questions in the chat.
Yeah, or observation or enthusiasm, whatever. I was just thinking when out in the field, we were doing wetland surveys just 2 days ago, and I'm going through here looking at plants that I was just calling out the names of 2 days ago, and it's like a special sort of intimacy to the moment. It's like you're meeting an old friend again. only talking about them like you didn't know them or didn't know them personally, but you feel sort of personal connection if you've been staring at them for hours just a couple of days ago. Like yesterday in seed collection, the sawtooth sunflower, the Helianthus serratus, was so thick it was like, and it still hadn't reached its maximum height yet, but it was up around eye height, and we're just wading through masses of it, trying to get to the plants we were collecting seeds of.
Like we
We're
had
just starting in
half
on the
a
blooming
question.
period of these plants, so.
I think that's is that Dave. I didn't see the rest of your question. I just saw that you started to type Tom. So feel free to add that to the chat or unmute and ask.
Okay, I'm gonna eliminate my my little screen of people because that creates a black spot on the screen. So you'll have to text Jackie if you have a, not text, use the chat feature to notify Jackie if you have a question, and she'll interrupt me. But by all means, ask questions as we go.
All right, we've got the question from Dave. So this will be our last one before we continue on, but Tom, do you carry a field guide on your walks, and do you use it?
All right, well, I mean, I always used to. That was a joke when I was back in the 80s when I was learning plants and at my forestry summer camp in Southern Illinois back in 1983, two or three. No, excuse me, would have been 1982, I think. Wandering around, and I had my Peterson field guide sort of glued to my hand, and people say they never saw me without it, or if that wasn't it, it was my Audubon field guide to trees of the Eastern United States. I mean, everyone starts there, and that's, whether it's Peterson's guide or whatever. I mean, there's no shame in doing this. In fact, that's a great thing. Those are great books. That's what they're made for, and they're great to use. And there are many online resources that are also useful today. I don't carry them in the field anymore. I typically, most of the plants that are in those books I can recognize. I say most, at least the ones that are in the area around where I'm working at the time. I don't carry them anymore, but I still have them on my shelf, and I look at them every once in a while. Sometimes just to reminisce, and sometimes because the pictures in there, the line drawings can be helpful if I have an unknown. So they're all very useful books.
I lied. There was one more short question. Is it worth saving daisy fleabane, or should I pull it as a weed?
Well, daisy fleabane, we're going to do that here in just a minute. The annual fleabane, there's annual, and then there's daisy fleabane, the Rigerin strigosus and Rigerin annuus. Rigerin strigosus is a much less common plant and typically occurs in sort of intact natural communities more often anyway, and prairie restorations and in prairies. Rigerin annuus is pretty weedy and it's around. I mean, I don't think of it as a troublesome weed. It seems to give way to other plants. I mean, it depends. I would like to have, frankly, like to have a little bit more in my swale next to my house because I always liked it. But if you have masses of it, then maybe it's worth getting rid of and getting some other things growing there. It's not a troublesome invasive, at least in my experience.
Great, that's all the questions we got, so you can keep going along.
Well, let's march onward and look at Rudbeckia species, the most common of which is the black-eyed Susan on the far left here. And it's so common that people often call most of the others black-eyed Susan just because of this similarity of the flower head, that deep sort of, I don't know, mostly brownish disc in the center with brown disc flowers and the rich, warm yellow ray flowers, hence give it that name, black-eyed Susan. Again, relatively few features, and we can start to pull these apart. So the with black-eyed Susan, the leaves are unlobed. They're very rough and hairy. All I can say is rough and hairy until you move it between your fingers. There's nothing like that sensation. There's a lot of things that are hard to put into words that are memorable, like smells. I mean, I never forget a smell, it seems like. And so even though I can't put a smell into words other than to say it smells like goldenrod, or it smells like medicine, or whatever. All right, so we get to more lobed leaves, the three on the right. If you're in the woods and you find this distinctive Rudbeckia flower head with a really deep brown disc and the rich yellow rays, and you see that distinctive three-lobed leaf, it's probably Rudbeckia triloba, the brown-eyed Susan. The flower heads tend to be smaller. It's a taller, more branchy plant, freely branched plant than is black-eyed Susan, which in nature typically is a lower growing plant. I say that with some caution because I put what I was told were black-eyed Susan's seeds in my garden in the backyard, and they grew 6 feet tall, and I've never seen it do that before. But usually this is a lower plant. This is somewhat taller and more freely branched plant. The sweet coneflower is again out in the open and into wet meadows. The leaves are more soft, fuzzy, very soft, fuzzy on the surface in those three-lobed leaves, and mixed together with, often on the plant higher up, unlobed leaves. So really not hard to tell apart from the brown-eyed Susan, and the big, many compound leaf and then freely incised or lobed leaves of the golden glow, or sometimes called green coneflower, Rudbeckia laciniata, many lobed leaf, and very smooth glaucous and glabrous stem to it. This one, in nature, I see it most often along rivers and streams. It will grow in wet meadows also. And it's a fairly tall, rangy plant. At least it commonly is up as tall as I am, close to 6 feet tall. The sweet coneflower and brown-eyed Susan a bit consistently shorter than it. Black-eyed Susan, at least in nature, typically the shortest of them, but also the most abundant. Again, we've done a lot of revision of our genera in the Chicago area, in the Florida, the Chicago region. And that just typically happens in botany. A lot of reassessment of the assignment of species to genera and genera to families with the advent of molecular biology and the ability to look at relationships in ways that no one could for the first couple hundred years of botany. And so a lot of movement of plants and a lot of renaming of genera, which always irritates people, because once you've learned a word like eupatorium, you don't want to have to change it to eutrochium, but that's the way it is. As we reassess and grow in our knowledge of plants, the names have to change. And so we're going to look at three common, what used to be eupatoriums, and now are two different genera. The common bone set, which to me is a simply elegant plant you see of wetlands. That word is like synonymous to me with bone set, and I don't know exactly how to put that into other words, but it's if you were a fashion designer, you would design a eupatorium perfoliatum bone set consistently in wetlands and wet meadows with wonderful perfoliate leaves. The leaves surround the stem. The stem seems to punch up right through the middle of the leaf. Just a beautiful arrangement. It's a beautiful plant. The Joe Pye weeds, somewhat more common. The purple Joe Pye weed on the right-hand side is one of woodlands, really open savannas. We typically have that in our savanna seed mixes. Be careful, they can be very aggressive. So if you put it in a savanna seed mix, don't get carried away with a lot of it. It can take over. And the spotted Joe Pye weed, a touch more conservative, occurring in wetlands and wet meadows. The spots refer to the spots along the stem. One of the things I find in assembling a presentation like this is you'll put together pictures and it looks like they're different colors between these two, whereas in nature, this to me is the color of a Joe Pye weed. That looks a little lighter than I'm used to seeing Joe Pye weed. This is certainly more blue than Joe Pye weed. Just the cameras don't work nearly as well as your eyes, and they typically change some of those colors slightly. They don't reproduce them with complete accuracy. But this sort of a pink color, pretty common in the Joe Pye weeds. The world leaves of the Joe Pye. Joe Pye, I guess, was an Indian Native American shaman at some point in the past. I'm not don't quite remember the story of how his name got attached to this plant. But typically 5 leaves of a node, or at least 3, a node being a point where a leaf attaches to a stem. Whereas you have 2 leaves of a node with the common bone set. Go ahead.
Is quinine in the same family?
Yes, and we're going to get to that in just a second. That's a very interesting composite flower, and we'll have some composite flowers in here that just to look at them, you can't even imagine that they are in the same family, but they are. So we'll get to quinine here in just a minute. So
Another question.
Okay.
Is another common name for purple Joe Pye, sweet Joe Pye?
I think so. I'd have to check that one. I have heard that common name, but I'd have to check to make sure that anyone in the listening in today knows that for a fact, just put it in the chat. I'd have to check that one. I've always called it purple Joe Pye. So, but common names are common names, which means it's the name that people commonly use for something. It doesn't come from a dictionary. It comes from the people. And I sort of don't like the idea of experts assigning common names to things that don't actually have a common name, because they're not common names. Common names should record. It's a colloquial name. It's what people use. It's what the culture has produced locally. And sweet Joe Pye might very well be another common name for purple Joe Pye. More things that used to be in the genus Eupatorium. We still have tall bone set, which is a sort of weedy plant that occurs in the edges of fields. You can see it in in interstate median areas. So growing in meadows that have been mowed and where everything has been eliminated, but the seeds have just drifted in and taken hold. Tall bone set can thrive. White snakeroot is a little bit more conservative, and you'll typically see it in oak woods. In woodlands, it's reasonably shade tolerant. Most of these composites typically are just not plants. At least I don't know of an exception. They are not plants of really shady areas. They are plants of open woodlands, or more often just open areas of prairies and fens and meadows. White snakeroot is that open woodland oak savanna. This used to be Eupatorium rugosum, and I like that name because it's a rugose leaf. Rugose means sort of pebbly. You see how the veins are deeply impressed, giving the surface of the leaf a sort of lumpy topography, micro topography. And to my eye, it's always more obvious in person than it even. I kept looking for pictures that would show that, and it's more obvious to me in person than it is in these pictures. Maybe just because of the way the light plays off a leaf when you're actually in person, and your head is moving and the leaf is moving relative to the sunlight. You can see that pebbly rugose surface very easily. But now its name is Agritinum altissimum, which now is virtually the same species epithet as the tall bone set. So different habitats, much wider leaf, much narrower leaf on the tall bone set. These have to be some of your favorites if you like prairie flowers. They adapt so well, particularly the spicata, just simply because it will occur in the sort of drier areas, adapt so well to growing around your home and gardens. Very, very neat, neat as in regular growth form, a beautiful spike that goes upward. and then this gorgeous spike of flower heads. Remember the determinate flowering pattern. So even though the individual flowering head is indeterminate, it starts flowering at the top, and then the flowering wave of flowering moves to the bottom. Now, the way to tell these two apart, I mean, in these two pictures here, you couldn't tell them apart. And early on in my work with plants, I looked at those and I went, how can anyone tell those two apart? All the pictures look exactly alike. But if you look closely, they're actually not hard. Remember the composite flowering head. This is a flowering head, and it has an involucre of bracts, or what are called filaries. And here those filaries flare out at the tips, or what are called reflexed. And the filaries of Liater spicata remain oppressed or flush with the surface of the involucre. So if you get up close and you look at that, that's actually a very reliable and easy to use character. These two stand out from the other. I call this, is using the term gay feather. I've always called the genus blazing stars. Maybe I just like that name. Here they're called prairie gay feather and marsh gay feather. Now let's look at two more blazing stars. Here the flower heads become bigger and fewer. And that's probably visually sort of gestalt of this plant. Looking at it, it looks as if it's less of a sort of continuous mass of flower heads going up the flowering stem, and rather separated into fewer and larger heads. Again, the flowers are really, this is probably, to my eye, probably the best rendition of the actual flower color. That's a bit too blue, and that to me is a bit pinker than I'm used to. But again, it's just hard to, I'm trying to get pictures that show the characteristics, and sometimes you have to put up ones where the color seems to be a bit distorted. So the glabrous stem of this, of the Liatris cylindracea, whereas the pubescent stem of the Liatris aspera, visually from a distance they look similar, somewhat wider leaves on the aspera, but this pubescent versus glabrous stem makes them fairly easy to tell apart. But here are two, again, looking for your daemon among these species. Here we get down into more. This is the, frankly, I'm one of these guys, a bit more common, a bit weedier, just kind of opportunistic, trying to figure out a place to grow. And here we have two that are probably often confused with one another, but really shouldn't be confused. This is the wild lettuce and the sow thistle. The name sow thistle is very hard for me to say. I don't know if it's something in my brain, but if I try to say it very fast, sow thistle, it just doesn't work. I have to pause, sow thistle. And if I say it 10 times, it will say foul thistle, and it will turn into that. So always a problem for me. But if we look at the, first at the flower heads, they both look like dandelion-like flowers, don't they? Only rays, no disc flowers on either of these heads. But look at the colors, a much richer, more dandelion-like color on the sow thistle than you find on the wild lettuce. It's a sort of paler yellow color. And it's certainly none of the I should say Sanchas. None of the Sanchas are prickly in the sense that an actual thistle is prickly. But if you feel along the leaf, particularly toward the base, some of the stiff hair-like projections from the leaf edge start to feel a bit prickly. That's certainly absent in the wild lettuce. So the sow thistles are a bit more prickly. Soft prickly is maybe a better description of it. The heads are much larger, more dandelion size heads, whereas these are much smaller, like a ½ inch across, so smaller, fainter heads, more freely branched inflorescence with many more flower heads in a full-grown wild lettuce. And the other, one of those interesting things you wouldn't notice unless you look for it, Here are the modified sepals, the pappus of the sow thistle flower. The flowering tube has fallen off. The ovary is left behind. That has now become the achene of the fruit of the sow thistle, and the sepals are the means of dispersal. Likewise with a wild lettuce, but look, this is like a dandelion. As the seed matures, the pappus is pushed up on a long beak. Dandelions do the same thing. If you look at a goat's beard, it's just this larger version of dandelion, has a long beak on that pappus. If you look at the flower before it's finished flowering, the pappus is attached directly to the top of the ovary. But when it finishes flowering, the flower head closes, and then when it reopens, that beak has grown on the wild lettuce or the dandelion or the goat's beard, whereas in the sow thistle or plants like asters or goldenrods, that pappus of hairs is attached directly to the achene. Coreopsis, these are gorgeous plants. There are more coreopsis. I put these two in because they're relatively common in McHenry County and are both in native prairies and in restorations. The prairie coreopsis is these beautiful, like a little bird's foot. In fact, I learned this is birdfoot coreopsis. I'm not sure what book I got that name from. It's more often called prairie coreopsis in the sources I see today, so I'll use that common name today. But again, the compound leaf here on the tall coreopsis, and the tall coreopsis is tall. It's taller than I am. I saw it all the time in prairie restorations and native prairies and down in DuPage County. I see it only rarely in McHenry. Maybe I just don't go to the right places, but I see it only rarely in McHenry County. It's a big, beautiful plant. The compound leaves that can occasionally have more than 3 lobes. But I want you to look at the thing that really makes a coreopsis seed head different. Coreopsis seed head different. If we look at a sunflower, pretty typical, a lot of composites, the involucre is made up of a lot of bracts, and the bracts are sort of shingled one on top of the other. In this case, the tip of the bracts is reflexed, but let's look at the involucre of a coreopsis. Let's look over at the prairie coreopsis. The involucre is really 2 series. There's this outer green series of bracts, and then there's an inner series. These here are the inner series of bracts. So there are 2 bracts, and each series has exactly 8 bracts, 8 outer and 8 inner bracts arranged very neatly under the composite flower head. A very distinctive feature of coreopsis. It's really not true of any of the other composites, at least not nearly as neat as that. So I see these as sort of a neat nick composites. Really, even where they could get away with it. Who looks at an involucre? The sunflower looks neat from above, but has this sort of unruly looking involucre below. Erigeron. Now, someone asked a question about erigeron. I've actually always liked these plants. I do like rare plants too, but I find a lot of beauty in the most common things around me. And these come in 2 different. There are other erigerons that I'm skipping here. There's a horseweed erigeron canadensis that has even a tinier flower, but I'll just do with these 2 probably. Well, ones that are probably the annual fleabane, probably the most common, and daisy fleabane, one that really occurs in our prairies and natural areas more commonly. So the way to tell them apart, the flower heads, no, I can't tell. If someone just snip off a flower head and asked me whether it was daisy, whether it was annual fleabane or daisy fleabane, I couldn't tell you the difference. But if you look at the whole plant, this is a much leafier plant. The leaves are larger, they're more toothed. Daisy fleabane has relatively few leaves, are much narrower, and if they have any teeth, they're very small. There's actually quite an obvious difference between the two. What I find myself doing sometimes is I keep looking for daisy fleabane. And so I picked the annual fleabane that has the fewest leaves and the smallest leaves, and I call that one daisy fleabane. Yeah, when you see this, it's obvious. And the word strigosus really refers to the hairs along the stem, which strigose means the hairs tend to lay down flat along the stem, whereas the hairs on annual fleabane stand up away from the stem. You might call that more pilose arrangement. And these are strigose, the hairs flush along the stem. And those are pretty good characters. I think the overall gestalt of the leaf size and arrangement along the stem, probably once you've seen the true daisy fleabane several times and seen it recently, you're not going to mistake that for annual fleabane.
Hey, Tom, we have a question.
Okay.
How do fleabanes differ from asters?
How do fleabanes differ from asters? That's a good question. I wish I had a really quick answer in the dichotomous key. Where do we separate off those two? I believe they both have seeds with pappus on them. I'd have to check that one. I mean, it's fleabane, the genus Erigeron, and these two fleabanes. Well, for one thing, just the massive number of ray flowers here. Really, there's no aster that has that many ray flowers. I suppose that's something, but there's probably some other technical characters that would just separate those two genera apart. Wish I'd thought of that question about 30 minutes before the presentation started. I could have looked in a book and found it for you, but I can't think of just a nice technical care that would separate those two, other than the obvious that this just has many ray flowers, quite a few more than you would find in a typical aster. And I think each of the rays are fertile in both cases. So even though it has lots of tiny little ones, this is a marvelous flower head. Each of those is a separate flower. That's just incredible to me. Each one of those rays is a separate flower. They've all been brought together in this tiny little flower head. It was amazing. It's basically a question. The basic Darwinian question to all life is, how do you reproduce? How do you make more of yourself? And so you see just these tremendously different answers to that question as you learn through the plant world. You find an orchid that has a simple flower that hasn't, and in that one flower can create literally over a million dust-like seeds. So that's how an orchid makes more of itself. With a composite flower, each flower makes only one seed, but they have miniaturized the flowers and gathered them into heads. And so in any one head, you can create more than 100 seeds. So it's all, every visit of a pollinator can potentially make many seeds. That's the thing that all these plants are trying to do. And they're just coming up with different solutions to the same problem. Here's our wild quinine. This is a fascinating, you wouldn't, maybe not even put this in the composite genus when you first looked at it, because the disc flowers are so tiny, it's hard to even see them. And there's, unlike any other composite head I know of, it's kind of the opposite of the fleabane we just looked at. Here we have only 5 rays, and we have the same number in each flower head. 5 ray flowers at rough equal, giving it a sort of pentagonal sort of arrangement to the flower head. And in this case, the rays are female and the discs are male. And so the tiny little seeds will be created by the disc flowers, or excuse me, the opposite. You'll find 5 seeds or fruits created by the 5 rays, and disc flowers are really specialized simply in producing pollen. And again, that more making theme, you have tiny little flowers gathered together into heads, and the heads gather together into masses like this, so that any one pollinator that stops and starts walking across the tops of these flowers is potentially gathering and dropping off pollen at hundreds of individual flowers and potentially creating hundreds of different seeds. And yes, quinine was produced in this. The story goes in World War I. I think there's a South American plant. I think it's South America, but I'm not sure what quinine the best source of quinine, but you could get it from wild quinine, and so it was used as an alternative source for malaria during World War I. Vernonia, here seems like this one has got the same pigment genes as the blazing star, and again the same problems with photography, reproducing the colors of these flowers. I see these more often in sort of wet meadow areas, although Missouri ironweed can grow up in the drier areas. And they look very similar from a distance. And really the way to tell them apart is just to go up and touch them and look at them closely. One is glabrous and the other is pubescent. They grow in very similar places. So you can't really know ahead of time which one you're looking at until you go up nearby. In my experience, Missouri ironweed is the more common around here, but fasciculata is present in the Chicago area, so you probably ought to keep both of those on your list. Some of the more showy of the late flowering composites. This is another one of those that is, for reasons I have no idea, is sort of close to my heart. This one is kind of a pain in the so-and-so, because it will grow in your backyard. Here's growing along a house, any sort of bare soil. It's called fireweed, and that fireweed is also used as the common name for an epilobium angustifolium that grows well north of here. But it's the common name of Eryctites hyracifolia, the only plant in that genus as far as that I'm aware of. The involucres sort of act like they stay closed even when the flowers are open. So this is in full and glorious bloom, not probably one you would plant for its showy flowers, and probably one you would pull out because it is adventive. It sort of moves into areas and it's big and lanky looking. Maybe I always felt awkward socially as a young man, so I always felt like a fireweed growing in other people's backyards. But this is, beauty in nature comes in all shapes and sizes, and this is those flower heads. When you get close and look at them, are actually quite interesting and beautiful. They just can't be appreciated from across the yard. Prickly, the fence or thistles are a fairly large group. We looked at a couple of thistles in the midsummer Tom Talk, both the Cardulus and Circeum. We're going to look at a couple of Circeum. The pasture thistle, both of these are native. This is the pasture thistle. Maybe it's the word thistle that I have a problem with. Pasture thistle. Circeum discolor. I see this every time I do my phenology route along the prairie trail. It's quite common there. In DuPage County, I was always seeing it in savannas, and that's listed as the habitat there. It's pretty common in the prairie trail isn't a savanna, but it has some savanna areas nearby, so I assume that was the source of the pasture thistle there. Very white underside to the leaves. Upland thistle of savannas, pretty easy to recognize, really just using those characters in terms of common thistles. There are other thistles with white undersides to leaves, some of them are rare ones. This is Hill's thistle, which is one I was involved, and Jackie were involved in counting. Hill's thistles, a rare native species in the prairies at Lake in the Hills Fen. A few weeks ago, here are the involucre. This is the involucre of the thistle. Now this, in this case, the involucre is not spiny. In this case, it's a very spiny involucre. The leaves are hairy here, but not white and below. These two are not going to grow in the same place. Telling these two apart is not going to be that much of a problem. You're probably going to confuse Hill's thistle. When we were doing our early survey of the Hill's thistle, we were seeing a lot of nodding thistle out there and some bull thistle, and having to differentiate those. You can look back at the Midsummer Tom Talk to review the characteristics on those. But this is Hill's thistle is a rare native species of dry prairies. Here's ones that I don't know that I even connected these as composites early on in learning plants because they didn't look like composites. They didn't have composite flower heads, right? Well, wrong. This is probably one of the most advanced composites, and I say advanced because it's really highly specialized. The composite flower heads are now either male or female. And the ones that cause me such a problem are these clusters of male composite flower heads here whose job is only to produce pollen. And they produce huge amounts of pollen. I mean, when this is releasing pollen, you walk through a ragweed field from the knees down, your pants are gold in color, and just masses of pollen released on the air. It's wind pollinated, unlike I think any of the other composites we've talked about so far. So this is the one that really makes my sinuses swell up. There's a close up, and you can see there it's an involucre. You see the little green bracts around the edge of the composite flower head, and probably half a dozen male flowers in there that have really been reduced to just masses of stamens. And where are the female heads? Well, they're a little bit lower on the plant. You probably don't even notice them. And again, they're highly specialized. You can't really see it. That's a close-up. You'd have to get even closer to see the tiny little green bracts. And there's only 2 female flowers, as opposed to a fleabane that has over 100 flowers in a head. Here you're down to 2. So you take that same basic organization in ambrosia, and now you specialize in the male and female and reduce the size of the flowering head down to simply 2 flowers. And it will create 2 little nutlets here in the head. And those, the bracts are then a bit spiny and actually grab onto your socks or animals as they go past as a means of dispersal. Here, the involucral bracts, like, well, we'll do burdock here in a minute. Burdock is the involucral bracts that grab onto you. So there's ragweed. The giant ragweed. Basically, the flower structures are the same. The plant looks very different. Rather than a very finely divided leaf of the common ragweed, it's typically in 3s, and those leaves will go up the stem. Big 3-lobed leaves, giant ragweed. Trifida, referring to those 3-lobed leaves. And this is another one that I wouldn't have guessed would be a composite, okay? What would give it away, you know? Well, basically, I didn't figure this out on my own. I was looking in books, and I saw that they put it in the family, and then went deeper and deeper to try to figure it out. These are, again, male and female flower heads are separate, like the ragweeds. The female flower heads, again, are specialized to 2 flowers, but they're surrounded. This is the involucre, the one that we had an English shepherd when I was a little boy, dog, and we must have lived in areas where there was a lot of cocklebur nearby, because it's the tips of the involucral bracts that are hooked that grab onto you. This is an annual plant of a wetlands like ragweed, or annual plants. Ragweed of just virtually almost any sort of disturbed soil other than standing water. Cockleburs are really sort of wetland specialists. They'll grow a little bit sort of damp edges, but they're not growing in many uplands. So farm fields that are flooded, I've seen cockleburs growing very typically in some flooded farm fields, the farm fields that get flooded by heavy rains. And those big female, so the two nutlets are inside of this burr. The male involucres are again specialized ephemeral, because they only need to last as long as for pollen dispersal lower down on the plant. So that's the burdock, another highly specialized. These are actually the most highly evolved of the composites, the ones that are probably the farthest away from their ancestral forms. And here's burdock, which is probably I've spent more time, well, probably stick seed. I showed you a picture of stick seed, that the long scorpioid cyme of the stick seed earlier. I probably spent more time pulling stick seeds out of my clothes than anything else, but burdock would be a very close second. And with a burdock head, you've got this is disc flowers only. There's no rays to this head. So it's, and when it matures, oops, no, I didn't. When it matures, this is a part of the burdock head, and you can see the really the filaries or the umbilical bracts of the burdock head then have a hook on the end, and so it's the whole head that grabs onto you, and the seeds are inside of that. And as you pick them out of your wool coat, you have to pick each one out separately. They sort of disintegrate once they grab onto you, and getting all the little pieces and parts out of your clothing is a real pain. But the burdock has these big floppy leaves. It's a biennial plant. So you see those, if you have it, if you see those big floppy leaves in your backyard 1 year, unless you're a real lover of plants, you'll probably want to get rid of it that year, because next year it's going to grow up and flower. And the problem, well, it's not a problem with having a kind heart. It means that if you let that burdock go, you're going to have 50 of them the next year. It's a very aggressive plant, so you have to make some choices in what grows around us. I did that once with a pokeweed growing next to my house, thinking what a big, beautiful plant it was. I let it grow, and the next year I had hundreds of pokeweeds coming up everywhere around the house, and it wasn't a very good choice. So, so one of the, we've still got a few minutes left. And I've got some more plants I can do, but this was my concluding slide, because we're going to be all back again here, in March next year. We're all going to be talking about plants again, and we'll all think we forgot everything we ever knew about plants. Well, now you have some Tom Talks to look at, to review. You can always get out your sources and start boning up on the plants again, because it's all going to happen all over again next year. And so with that, I can go to questions, Jackie, or I can just look at some more plants now. What do you think I ought to do? Let's take some questions first, and if we run out of questions, I can show you some more composite plants, because I do have quite a few more plants that will be on the PDF. I just decided in the end that I didn't want to try to do too much in one presentation. So, do you have any questions now?
Again, you can unmute and ask your question or add it into the chat. We had a comment about a cat or dog flea and tick comb removes those burrs pretty well. What's the latest blooming aster in fall? New England aster or aromatic?
Well, I think New England aster is the one I noticed, but then that may be just because it's the showiest. It seems to hang on the longest in my experience. But look back at my phenology routes from next year to see there's one plant that I was waiting for and going back to those last few places. I'd have to look back at that route. Go ahead, Jackie.
According to a Google search, purple and sweet Joe Pie are the same. Peterson guide notes that crushed leaves smell of vanilla. Looking forward to checking it out. Okay,
that's good. Good thing to know. I love smells, so I'll have to try
that. How does blazing star reproduce?
Well, it's a typical of many of the aster family, the composite family. Each individual, it's only disc flowers, and so each individual flower will create a little achene, a little nutlet, and that will have little pappus of white hairs attached to that nutlet, and it will disperse on the wind. That's true of asters and goldenrods, and obviously dandelions and sow thistles, and so many, but certainly not all composites use use the wind as a means of dispersal. Things like sunflowers. I mean, if you look at a sunflower, it's just, or a dock, it's just a big honking seed, and you wonder, well, how does that, doesn't blow very far? It can't float on the water. There's no water here. It doesn't have any prickles on it. Well, it's what it's doing is animals are gathering those seeds and storing them and moving them and storing them. So a goldenrod is a sunflower is a similar means of dispersal to an oak tree. It's using animals to gather and cache the seeds, to move them around for them. So they use, it's plants evolved in a world with animals, and so you not only have to create more of yourself in terms of creating lots of seeds, but you have to get the seeds away from the parent plant. That's another one of those evolutionary imperatives, is because wherever you are, sooner or later it won't be a good place to be. It'd be good now, but sooner or later it will be a bad place to be. And so you've got to get those seeds away from the plant, whether it's on the wind. There are plants that disperse their seeds on the water. There are plants that, hitchhiker seeds, we call them, that grab onto animals and plants, and ones that trick or just use animal and plants to move the seeds around, like oaks or sunflowers.
Had a comment. Thank you for making the parts I never wanted to learn interesting instead of only wanting to learn by sight. Enjoying the phenology program too.
Well, the phenology program gives you the opportunity to go back to the same place over and over again, which is you wouldn't do otherwise, and to watch the plants grow and develop and create a flower bud, and you're thinking, well, maybe next time you come and it's not quite ready, and then the next time you finally see one out of the 300 in flower, and you wait the next time to mark down your start bloom date. It's fascinating to watch things develop, and the phenology program has really given me the patience to go back and watch that happen through the year. It's been a fun program to be a part of.
Where can you get the Kane County Wild Plants bookstore, Kane County?
Well, you can still get it on Amazon now. And any of these you can get on Amazon. And I think you can get that at some nature bookstore still. I hope they keep it in print. It's one of those, just a priceless. Newcomb's and Peterson's is where a lot of people start, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. There's good pictures. Newcomb's has a very simple keying system in there that can help you out when you're starting. You'll probably, if you want to go very far in your botanizing, you'll probably need to learn how to use dichotomous keys eventually. But when you're getting started off, I start off with Peterson Guide, and I still, I get nostalgic every time I pull it off the shelf and look at it, because I spent so much time and the pages are falling out of my original copy now. But Kane County is definitely several steps above that in terms of its completeness in its treatment of the flora of the area. So that's definitely a step up in terms of its usefulness as a flower guide for our area. Beyond that, you're really going to be looking at Flora of the Chicago region, or one of the older editions of Plants of the Chicago region.
They got any Tom walks coming up?
Well, I don't know. I have to talk to my volunteer coordinator and see if we can get some Tom walks coming up.
Scheduling wise, we were kind of talking about taking a break as we head into seed collection season this fall, and we're having a lot of work days during the week, but you usually end up learning a lot if you come to a work day, because Tom is at a lot of those, and whatever is there, he ends up talking about. So good chance to ask your questions too.
And if you're ever on a work day and I'm there, then you should use the opportunity. Just offering, you should use the opportunity to ask me any question you want. There's nothing in life I enjoy more. Well, maybe one or two things, but they're co-equal. Talking about nature and helping people to understand nature is my calling in life. I don't say that word lightly. That's just who I am and what I do, and I love it. So anytime you're around me, you can ask questions or send me an email, a text message, anything, and I'll answer it. I love it. We got 10 minutes left. Should I just show a few more? I've got a few more composites even I can show that I took out at the last minute that
There was another question.
okay.
What was the aster bush you referred to?
Oh, I said that I said the New England aster looked like a shrub. It's not a shrub. It is a herbaceous plant. There is a, when you said that, I immediately remember there is a, I mean, composites become woody plants in the tropics. And there's one that comes up into South Alabama that I learned when I was down there, but the genus is escaping my mind now. It was actually a shrub in the composite family. Sometimes I'm good with names that I haven't used in 20 years, but this one is, I'll probably think of it right when we are offline here. Let's look at if we have any more questions, we can talk about those, or I can just talk about a few more composite species now and some other plants. I enjoy doing this, so I'll do either.
There's not currently any questions in the chat.
Okay, well, here's a genus
we'll check
that's really not an uncommon genus, and I picked two of them here. One of them is really very common. In fact, it's on our phenology list. It's an introduced species, Heraceum cesspitosum, the field hawkweed. Hawkweeds have a dandelion-like flower, so only raise very hairy and can't really quite see it. Really long, stiff hairs on both the leaves and the stem. In fact, that's true of a lot of Heraceums. And whenever I see a plant with long, stiff hairs standing up away from the surface, I start thinking, well, that must be a hawkweed, just because that is so common among the hawkweeds. This one, and this one is what's called scapose. This is an interesting word. Scapose means that all the leaves are at the base, and then it sends up a stem that creates a flower. A prairie dock is scapose, or virtually scapose. If there's any leaves on the stem, they're very tiny and toward the bottom. Canada hawkweed just has flower as leaves going up the stem. It's a native perennial, somewhat less common in our area. Pussy toes. Now, I put both of these in there. It's the plantain leaf pussy toes. That's the common one in our area. This one will persist even in sort of mowed turf grass sometimes. I don't know whether it's simply the last of those plants that's left as the turf grass is taken over and it's been mowed, because it's so low and the leaves are right next to the ground. It's not killed by the mower, and it sends up these flowering shoot with little clusters of disc flowers. It's a cute little plant. The difference between these two, similar in their overall morphology, but the plantain leaf has a wider leaf with more visible veins in it, whereas the Antinnaria neglecta, the woolly cat's foot, the obvious vein is only the central main vein, and the leaves are somewhat smaller. Again, this one, I remember, this is quite rare in McHenry County. This one is not uncommon, not super common, but not uncommon. You're more likely to see the pussy toes on Plantagenetifolia than you are the neglecta. There's just another, I mean, to me, these are amazing. I know that picture gets a bit granular at that size because I couldn't find anyone that had looked that closely. It's because we don't often get that close to nature to appreciate a whole scale of beauty and diversity that completely escapes the eye as you walk past. As you get closer and closer and closer, and you look at all of these detailed little structures, to me, that's just a part of the amazing. It's one of the reasons I carry hand lines around my neck, is just to keep looking at those tiny, tiny little structures and the beauty that's completely missed as you simply walk past a plant. And if just a few non-composite species that are flowering at this time of year. These are the prairie clovers, legumes. I showed you purple prairie clover just as as showing you an indeterminate head of flowering at the base, and those flowers moving upward along the head. It's beautiful, finely dissected leaves. And the white prairie clover with somewhat coarser compound leaves, just the individual leaf segments are somewhat larger. And if you have them together, they're pretty easy to tell apart. When you haven't seen one and you're just looking at the other, sometimes you can start imagining things. But the white, when they're in flower, of course, the striking difference in flower color makes them fairly easy. Both beautiful perennial plants of our prairies. Lead plant, a gorgeous plant. Typically, it says mesic to dry prairies. I usually see this in drier places with the long compound leaf, because it's such a hairy plant. The flowers, have a sort of blue-violet color to them. Because it's such a hairy plant, the plant always has a sort of silvery sheen to me, particularly on a sunny day. When I encounter it, the tiny little hairs reflecting the light gives the whole plant a sort of silvery sheen. And then you get a little bit closer and you see those compound leaves with many leaflets, and the sort of purpley color of the flowers make this one a fairly easy one to identify. In Canada milkvetch, in the place we were doing our work a couple of days ago, there were just in a prairie restoration, just great masses of Canada milkvetch. Here you can start to see that the typical legume flower structure. If you just look right at this one where my cursor is, there's the flag or banner petal that's on top. These are the two lateral petals that go to either side. And in the center is what looks like the keel of a boat, and it's actually two petals fused together. So the legume corolla is 5 petals, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the center. And that's conserved over almost, not all, but almost all the legumes in our area have that, what's called the papilionaceous or butterfly pattern of the legume flower. I went through that in somewhat more detail in the midsummer Tom Talk. So we have that long spike here. The flowers are without any pedicels, so you call that a spike, and then long compound leaves. A much less showy legume flowers. I mean, when you're talking about things that are flowering late in the year, the composites and legumes really dominate. And if you look at non-broadleaf plants, grasses, composites, and legumes really dominate the flowering aspect of the late summer prairie. And so legumes are not as numerous as composites, but there are quite a few of them. And this is the round-headed bush clover, Lespedeza capitata, just the rounded nature of these clusters of flowers, giving it that name. Here you can see that classic legume flower shape. There's the banner or flag petal on the top. Now let's look at the difference between this, which is a nice prairie species, and this, which is a very troublesome invasive. And this is one that you want to get rid of if you get it into your prairie restoration. It spreads rapidly and becomes a real pest. Look at the difference in the shape of the leaf. Widest out near the tip, more of a rounded tip. Widest in the middle, more of a pointed tip on the native. That cuneate shape refers to the wedge shape at the base of the leaf of Lespedeza cuneata, the Sericea lespedeza. Yeah, definitely worth learning those two to keep your eye out for this one and to try to keep it out of any prairie restoration or native prairie that you have. It typically gets into seed mixes, and so it's a contaminant in the seed mix in some of our prairie restorations, and we need to get it out as soon as we notice it. And this one, that's neither composite nor legume, but a really interesting plant. Anyway, and another example of seed dispersal, and I'll finish here in 30 seconds because we're getting right to noon. These gorgeous flowers, and we have a pale touch-me-not you can call these jewel weeds or touch-me-nots. I used to call them touch-me-nots. I hear people using the term jewel weed more often now, but you can pick either one. Pallida, which was by far the more common one in DuPage County, where I worked in the early 90s, and I would only see Capensis, the spotted jewel weed or touch-me-not in wetlands. When I come to McHenry County, this becomes by far the more common one, and pale jewel weed, the less common. The stem is almost translucent. It has very little sort of secondary cellulose supporting. It's really held up by the turgor pressure. It grows in moist places, so it's that water pressure that's holding the plant up. But the coolest thing about this plant is that it creates these capsules that are explosively dehiscent. So you wonder, well, how do seeds get someplace? And I talked about wind and water and hitchhiker seeds and seeds that trick animals into carrying the seeds places. Well, this one explodes and throws the seeds away from their present location. So when that capsule is mature, it will eventually dry out and pop and just throw the seeds a few feet in all directions or in any direction. You catch it at just the right time, as it's almost ready to explode, and just touch it, it will blow up when you touch it, which is always just a treat of mine. You're walking in late in the year with a newbie to flowers and to nature, and you can find one of those that's all swelled up for them to touch, because that always gives them a big thrill. So I'll leave it there for now. We've reached noon. Thank you for joining us today.
And one final comment in the chat of appreciated hunting for my daemon to see if it would show up. Plants I've built relationships with came up during the presentation, and finally toward the end, the first plant that came to me and introduced itself many years ago appeared, the thistle. Thank you, Tom.
Well, I think mine was side flowering aster. It was going to be fireweed, which maybe fireweed is my brother, but side flowering aster, I think, was my daemon today. So anyway, thank you very much for coming. If anyone would like to hang around, they can hang around and share their daemon, but or any other questions. But yeah, I'll stay here as long as anyone wants to hang around and ask questions.
I'm guessing we had a lot of our questions answered earlier. We're
Sure.
getting some thank yous in the chat, so
Okay.
we will leave it until next time, and hope to see you at some of our upcoming work days.
Okay, we'll hope to see you at the work days, or maybe at a Tom Talk in the winter.